Let's talk about two bills in particular that are coming up here. We have universal background checks and we have red flag laws. And those are both coming up in the public safety omnibus bill, likely next week. I understand you've taken a stance on how you plan to vote on those. Why don't you share a little bit about that?
You know, when we started the session, there were a lot of gun legislation introduced, and some of them were far-reaching. There was a gun registry bill, there was a gun storage law, and after a lot of conversations in my district with law enforcement, in town halls, with mothers, with gun owners, I came to the conclusion that some of those bills were far too reaching to make sense for our state. And so I came out against those bills. But I also grew up hunting with my family. I grew up with that responsibility that we have as gun owners. And I came to the conclusion that we have to do something. There have been far too many school shootings. There have been far too many gun violence in our streets. And so looking at background checks and the extreme risk protection orders made sense to make sure that we are addressing these where we can.
You've been heralded as kind of a swing vote on this legislation for a while. I mean, there was even a campaign asking constituents to call you up and urge you to vote no on gun legislation. What prompted you to finally make that decision?
Well, I've had a lot of conversations with folks in the district about the need to do something. I've talked to sheriffs and police talking about their hands being tied when families reach out to them about concerns they have with those that they live with, perhaps being a threat to themselves or others. We have to be able to give the tools to law enforcement to address those concerns. Equally, I've heard from mothers talking about concerns dropping their kids off at school. And, you know, I'm a father, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I can't look my kids in the eye and tell them that there's nothing that we could do to address gun violence and school shootings. And so this is really, I think, the bare minimum of what we can do to try to make a difference in the school shootings that have been happening all across our country.
Why was that not a decision that you came to sooner? Why did it take you some time to make that decision?
Like I said, many law enforcement individuals in our district mentioned that they needed better tools in order to address these concerns. There's a lot of concerns around ghost guns and straw purchases, and the background checks will help us address that issue as well. So, you know, in those conversations, I needed to better understand where my district was at, where professionals and stakeholders were at that deal with these issues on a daily basis, and where families were at. And I came to this conclusion through those conversations.
And I want to talk a little bit about those conversations real quick, because I think that was one thing that you had mentioned was a priority. Talking to constituents and making sure those things happen before you take a stance on this issue. I have a quote here that you issued in a statement a little while back. You said, "I'm taking my time to meet with law enforcement, stakeholders, and constituents in my district to hear their concerns and determine how we move forward." How did those meetings shape your decision?
Well, you know, I heard a story from one law enforcement individual in our district tell me a story about a family that came to him to ask for guns to be taken away from a family member who was a risk to themselves and their family. And that law enforcement official had to tell that family that there was nothing that he could do in that instance. That family later was able to get guns on their own out of the hands of that family member, but then the sheriff had to charge them with burglary. That's not the way that we should be addressing concerns about gun violence and threats from within a household. So again, giving these tools, having those conversations helped me understand why this was important.
And are you confident that that decision is the right decision for your constituents?
I'm absolutely certain. Like I said, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and if this legislation helps us stop one school shooting in Minnesota, to me, that makes all the difference in the world. I would feel heartbroken if I didn't support doing something in this moment when children could die. And so I think we need to think about this as gun owners. You know, I grew up with my grandfather teaching me gun responsibility. In fact, I remember the first time that I went out hunting with him, he turned to me and he said, you know, as a gun owner, we have a responsibility. And if you're not ready for that responsibility, then I'm going to take this gun away. And I've had that conversation stick with me. And I think all gun owners want to reduce gun violence. All gun owners understand the responsibility that we have in doing what's right. And I think in this moment, this is a small way that we can make a huge difference for our children and for our families and keeping our streets safe.
Some might say you represent a sort of purple district, the Iron Range being a hardy combination of red versus blue voters. Do you view yourself as a sort of purple lawmaker in some senses?
Absolutely. I have to feel pressure on every single issue given the dynamics in our district and being a tight district. And I think that makes me a better legislator. Having those tough conversations with all stakeholders on all sides of issues makes me a better senator. Not every legislator has to have those tough conversations. Many can make decisions based on their own feelings immediately, and I don't have that luxury. But I don't even see it that way. I see it as an opportunity for me to have thoughtful conversations with all stakeholders and coming to the best conclusion that works not only for our state, but more specifically for our region.
Do you think that that sometimes puts you in a tough spot with members of either party, kind of being a voice that's in the middle almost?
It's not a tough spot, it's an opportune spot. It's a spot where I can make a difference on all pieces of legislation. It's an opportunity for me to work with the other side on, outdoor recreation initiatives. It's an opportunity to work within my own party on, molding legislation in a way that I think works for Greater Minnesota and for the Northland. And I think I've done that in this session.
And I think we would be remiss in this particular conversation if we didn't mention Senator Tom Bach, your predecessor. Mm-hmm. He famously was one of the independents in the state Senate. Do you think that's a testament to what the Iron Range needs to see from a lawmaker?
Yeah, I think I've always approached it in a similar way, looking at all legislation not from a party lens or from an ideological lens, but from a practicality lens. What can we do to make this legislation work for the Northland? When it comes to these gun legislation before us, I've made a lot of changes that make sure that they work for our region. For instance, when we're talking about the background checks, we're not talking about hunting rifles. We're not talking about shotguns. And so that's really an important piece. We also made it so that family members and friends can transfer guns between one another if they're going to a shooting range or if they're going hunting. I remember getting a gun from my uncle when we were on a hunting weekend. That's an important part of our traditions in the Northland. So making those changes to make this legislation work made a lot of sense. When it comes to the extreme risk protection orders, we made sure that there's a high standard for a court order when considering those types of things. So there's a lot of opportunities for me to make fixes to legislation, and I think we've gotten to the right size with these bills to address the concerns with school shootings and address the concerns with gun violence while making sure that we're protecting gun owners' right.
Ultimately, how do you think your constituents will view this legislation and will view this decision?
Well, gun owners understand the responsibility that comes with gun ownership. They understand that when you own a gun, you have a responsibility to be safe with that gun. And so I think they know that when we are considering these types of legislation, we can be gun owners and we can have the traditions that we have while doing the things that we need to do to keep our kids safe.
Are you ready for some folks to be perhaps a little upset about that decision?
I think no matter what I do on any piece of legislation, there's going to be folks that disagree with me, and that's okay. And I want to continue to have conversations with folks that maybe don't necessarily agree with me on everything, because again, that makes me a better legislator. I hope to continue these conversations, whether it's on guns or on schools or any other issue, so that we can get to the right size fit for the Northland and for our state.
Senator, thanks so much for doing this, and I appreciate your time, and good luck out there on the floor.
Thank you.